And so I'll turn it over to Andrea Rivera-Smith to take us through mission recruitment. Andrea.
Yay. Okay, so I'm Andrea. I work here at the State Personnel Office, and I had a really weird dream about this last night. So this is going good already. My dream is not becoming life, which is very good because that was scary. You guys wouldn't want to see that. So I'm here to talk about recruitment, but I like to kind of start with the rule and kind of break down all the things that the rule talks about, because we at State Personnel Office are asking for things or questioning things. So I think it's really important to make that connection and say, oh, okay, that's where that's coming from. All right, so our objectives for today, I want to talk about the rule. I want to talk about the history of recruitment.
Can you stand right here a little bit?
Oh, the camera. Minimum qualifications, key terms. We're going to do a little segment with Sheila called Applicant 101, where you may or may not get up, Sheila. Okay, and then we want to talk about the future and beyond, because the future and beyond is the most exciting part to me. It's kind of like what we're doing with our podcast. It's about, okay, now that we got this covered as far as the rules and the process, and we feel like we've kind of tweaked it enough where it makes sense, how do we actually start benefiting and helping our hiring managers get the best out of this whole process, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so I like to call the recruitment rule number 5, and all the rules, start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, recruitment's 5, pays 4, right guys? But when I first started at SPO, people would be sitting in a meeting and they'd be like, oh, we're talking about rule 6 today, or rule 7, and I'd be like, what in the world? And so then I got it. I'm like, so Rule 5 I thought was really cool. It's kind of broken down into 5 sections, so it's something you won't forget when you're thinking about recruitment. We talk about vacant positions, recruitment, applications, examination, and selection. And even if you look at the objective of the recruitment rule, it kind of talks about why we exist. We exist to create a recruitment system, examination, and to have a selection process. So that's what the rule says if you break down the objectives of that rule number 5. So let's start off with vacant positions. I like the vacant positions section of the rule because that's where we get things like recruitment waiver. Sometimes we'll get people calling us saying, well, where's the recruitment waiver rule? Like I'm doing a search, control find, and I can't find recruitment waiver. And it's because it's not in the rule. The rule just says that all vacant positions have to be advertised for unless otherwise specified by the director. So if you're searching for that or someone's asking you to cite it, that's where you can find it in this first section of the rules. It also says open, it defines open for recruitment, and it talks about soliciting internal and external applicants. So sometimes you'll hear us ask you, right, if you want to advertise just internally, we'll ask you and say, well, help us understand why. We need the justification. We started off asking you guys to submit a letter from your agency head or HR manager, and now we're just asking for a justification that we include in the notes section of our advertisement. But that's why we do that, because of that rule, and because it requires us to have both types of applicants, that if we go away from that, then we need to get an approval or justify it. It also talks about advertising for vacant positions unless authorized by the director. I just mentioned that. That's our recruitment waiver. Does anybody remember what it used to be called before a recruitment waiver? Yeah, we used to call it EOR. So when I first got hired into SPO, I was an EOR, and I had no idea what that meant. I just knew they told me to show up. So now that I reflect back all these years later, it's kind of interesting to see how things have changed.
It's called EOR.
EOR, yeah.
I like call them now EOR. That's my short
right.
definition for recruitment waiver.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it too. It has to be definitely an exception. In this section of the rule, it talks about having to fill within the assigned classification. So once it says that, it gives you options, right? It talks about underfill, talks about double fill, and then job sharing, 2 part-time people sharing a job. Double fills, we use them all the time. Sometimes we do it for knowledge transfer. So if you have someone retiring, those types of things. Human Services uses it sometimes for their family assistance analysts, right, Gerard? Because you're constantly churning, and so sometimes it helps them create a pool of people so that when people leave, they're just slotting them into the vacant position. So there's different reasons or ways you can use double fill as a tool in your organization. other than the black and white, oh, I have someone retiring and they have all this knowledge, you know, I need to double fill. I've been getting a lot of questions about underfills lately because people are like, how do you do that? And so basically you can, instead of using the assigned classification, you can fill the job at a lower level for up to a year. And so sometimes that gets a little tricky when you actually try to advertise the job. That's where I get a lot of questions like, oh, that's great, but how do I get that on Share? So we have different strategies or ways to help you, but you can use, if you have an existing classification in the smaller or the lower level, let's say you wanted to underfill an HR A to an O, you can pick a vacant O in Share. Sometimes you won't have the vacancy, so we can work with you on how to kind of trick the system so that you can advertise for an underfill if needed. So I think it's a good option. It's always important to pay attention to the qualifications of the job, because if you underfill and someone doesn't qualify for a job for 2, 3, 4 years, then you're like, this might not be a good candidate for an underfill. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, now the second section in that rule talks about recruitment. And basically it says SPO is responsible for creating the means or the home to recruit for positions in the classified service. So we're kind of creating that foundation. Right now we're using Share. It also talks about our protected classes and that people are able to apply for jobs and have the opportunity to compete. It talks about making sure that agencies ensure that there's diversity in the workplace. And then it talks about applications that are submitted. Have any of you had someone submit an application and they might have not been truthful about the transcripts they submitted? Or that's happened a couple times and people find out about it after the fact. But it does address that in that section of the rule, that the employing agency is how it words it, needs to notify the director if they have that scenario. The other thing it talks about is if you falsify information or if you solicit, accept a bribe, anything like that to accept a job. Those are the two things that are obviously a no-go. After that, it talks about appealing an application. So sometimes we would get calls saying, I would like to appeal to the board because I was rejected. And so we have to be really clear, because the rule talks about those two circumstances, right? So if I want to say, I want to appeal because I didn't meet the minimum qualifications, that's not the same thing. So if you get those kinds of questions, now you know where to go in the rule or where that's cited. Of course, you can always call us, but I think that's really helpful because sometimes applicants will go look at the rules on their own and start asking us those types of questions. Before, when our process was much more restricted, we get a lot more of those calls. I haven't gotten as many now that we have been updating our process. Okay, so next it breaks it down in the rule to the application section. And it just says that the director shall establish application procedures that comply with federal rules. And then it also talks about, hold on, I skipped ahead. So the rejection of the applications is actually in the application section. So I'm not going to go over that again, but in the recruitment section, it talks about the fact that we at the State Personnel Office are responsible for accepting applications and creating that process to include a timeline that the applications are submitted. Okay? So if you are looking to say, oh wait, I have a candidate who wants to appeal, it's in the application section, not the recruitment one. Okay? And then we have examination, and that's kind of one of the backbones of why the rule why this recruitment rule exists. And I think it's really interesting if you look historically how we've kind of dealt with examinations. The one thing that we always make sure to tell you guys is that if a hiring manager is wanting to do any kind of test, that it needs to come here and it has to come to the class and comp division because they're assessing the criteria of that test. Anytime you have a situation like that, it's just good to call us so we can help you. Even if you think, oh, it's simple, they're just wanting to test blank, it's still good to make sure that we've made sure that the validity and all that good stuff with an examination is okay. I like to use DOT because you guys are really black and white example of testing that happens that's pretty standard, and they do it for their, what do you call them, Jason? Your highway maintenance? Yep. I was just making sure everyone knew what HMW meant because I just forgot. Okay, yeah, highway maintenance workers, but yeah, they do the demonstrated abilities test where you have to drive a vehicle or like what are some of the vehicles? Like yeah, and you have to do certain things like back up or, you know, that type of skills test. So that's a really easy one that they have to do based on the type of equipment those positions are using. Okay, so I also think it's interesting, you know, we talk a lot about resident and veterans preference points. If you listen to our podcast or any types of trainings, it actually comes from this section of the rule. So if you're looking for it, that's where you would find it. And it talks about the additional points we give to veterans and residents. So we apply those points, the veterans points, after the list is already scored. And that's what the language asks us to do. And then it also talks about residency points, how many points you can get for each year, up to 10 points. So that's where that section is in case you have questions. Okay, and then we have the selection section of the rule. So that's number 5. And it's talking about making sure that when we make selections, it's based on ability, qualifications, and ability. And that section of the rule, I find it really interesting because it also says that it has to be justified in writing, because we get lots of questions and agencies do things a little differently. But why do I have to write it on a PARP, even if it doesn't need to go to SPO? Or, you know, why does HR have to write a little blurb? But here it's requiring us to make sure that we document that kind of hire. And sometimes internally you'll have different forms that you use. That's okay. A lot of you are probably using the PARP just because it makes more sense and you're not having to use 2 different forms. But I always like to point out where those things come from, especially when we get questions like, why do I have to do that? This section of the rule also talks about the Criminal Offender Employment Act, and that's just talking about if there is a conviction, when you can make a determination on a selection. The rule just talks about that has to happen when they're at the finalist level, not necessarily just on a list. Now, of course, you might have some positions that are, that's a no-brainer, right? Like corrections, Lisa, you guys have the cadets, where it clearly says you cannot have a felony or whatever the case may be. And it also talks about employment lists. It says that we're responsible for providing an employment list that include ranked lists of people who have met the established criteria. So a little later on, we'll go over the definitions and I'll show you what established criteria mean. The key terms, I always like to point out the key terms, and that towards the end of the PowerPoint, I listed them, and I didn't print it on purpose because I felt like printing 33 pages of color just made me sad. So we're going to send it out after this and give it to you in different sections. So hopefully it'll be more useful to you. Okay. And so now we talk about the act. You guys have heard me probably talk about this a lot, especially like in hearings. We get asked a lot why we do what we do. And basically it just requires we give the employer a list of ranked candidates. Okay. And once you get the PowerPoint, I have included links in there so you can go directly to that page in case someone's asking you. Okay. All right, so this is one of my favorite parts of this training because it's like looking back at the history of SPO. So I did this training for just SPO employees about a month ago, I'd say. And I did it because we had lots of new employees that I thought would really benefit from understanding where we've come. But then I thought, and I was going to take it out for this training, but I thought it would probably be just as useful because you're dealing with new leadership, and they're probably coming to you being like, what in the world? Why do I do this? And why are you telling me, you know, that? And so I thought, let's just go over how we've evolved. And so we broke them up into 3 areas. And the first one we're calling the Bronze Age. And you guys might remember some of this, but they did lots of testing. They did banding. Then we're doing classical antiquity. And that's kind of the middle, right? And that was, to me, was it rigid enough? And then we did kind of like what we're in now. I would say more of like a renaissance where you're trying to like look at things and make change. And we're trying to find the balance. You guys aren't laughing like the other group, so maybe I don't know, it's not that funny. But, okay, so the Bronze Age. So this is, how many of you remember banding? Yeah. So banding was, you know, you had these different categories, I guess, of a list. And I think it was alpha, so like A, B, C, D. And you would take an examination and you would be put into one of those categories depending on how you performed. What was really interesting about banding is it wasn't about each individual agency's position, but it was more about classification. So if you were applying for an admin job, you would be in a group for people looking for admin jobs like across the board through state government. And so to me, that was probably the most extreme when you think about it. Some of the cons of that would be you're losing the uniqueness of each individual agency, and then people had to wait a long time, and a lot of this process was unknown. Like they knew the overarching process, but they didn't know where they were or were they going to get a call back. So that's why we put it in the Bronze Age. Okay, so classical antiquity. This is kind of like, I know this well because this is when I first came to the state personnel office, and this is what everybody was doing. We used a system at before 2005, AS400. Do any of you guys remember that? That was what they used to get the advertisements out there. And they used something called recommended qualifications. And as we kind of move away from that, now it seems like, whoa, remember we used to do that. And basically we were just, as an agency, a hiring agency, identifying what the ideal candidate looked like. And that's all we would put for qualifications. So, and not everybody's recommended qualifications were equal. They weren't the same across the board. So if you were hiring at CYFD an HR person, you might put a bachelor's in 5, and I at SPO might put, something different, associates in 5, or maybe high school in 5. So that's totally different from what we, basically, if you create a middle, there is no beginning point. You can just say, I would ideally like someone with a bachelor's in 5, but that doesn't mean I can't hire somebody with high school in 0, right? Or 1 year or 2 years or 3 years in something totally different. So that was kind of the potential con of that strategy. Hiring managers received the entire list. I don't know if you guys remember that or not. That was in Share. And there were some of the cons were that hiring managers called and were very overwhelmed because you're giving them lots of candidates. So how, when you're so busy, for some of these jobs, sift through sometimes 200 applications. So that was kind of some of the pushback that we got. And even if you read more current information about the application process, they call that more of like a funnel, or just everyone's dumping in instead of finding what you're looking for. But I'll go into that a little later. And then our most recent phase is what we're calling the Renaissance phase. And we're trying to ask ourselves, did we learn from ancient times? Because with Share, we did recommended qualifications. And then because it was so open, we totally swung the pendulum the other way, and we started doing a very structured system. And you saw the rise of minimum qualifications. Minimum qualifications basically were established for every single job, and that totally changed the game, because that now you're saying you cannot get in this door or hired into this job without having these qualifications. So that caused a little bit of an issue when you were doing the opposite for almost 10 years. You had some people being like, well, I don't even qualify for the job I'm in, and I've been doing it for 10 years. How the heck am I going to go get a promotion now? So we had to deal with some of that. I was looking at some of the quarterly reports, and it was when Justin Ajayko was, I think, when he first became the director. You can read his memo, I think, to the board, and it was talking about what they did to create minimum qualifications and all the groups or SMEs they created within the agency in a really short period of time to get that, to create that qualification. And so sometimes we're looking at the qualifications and we're being like, oh, why did they do this? Or this is not getting me what I need. And that's why we need to hear that feedback, because if you look back in history, they were created really fast, and they were created in a point of time where people were not used to thinking the way we do about baseline criteria. So it's just important to know that you have access to that information too, and you can say, oh wait, look, they're writing about minimum qualifications, and they're telling the board that they got all these committees together. And it was committees, let's just say from the environment department, some environmental scientist or content experts to say, okay, well, what does an environmental scientist even need? So that's how all of that happened. Our certification process was incredibly restricted, right? So if you guys remember, if you said you had a bachelor's degree and you didn't attach your transcripts, what happened? You're out. Or if you said you had 10 years and the job only required 6, but you only showed 8, what would happen? You're out. And it could be super subjective depending on the person reviewing the application. So I call this a pretty dark era for me, because we at SPO, you know, you got to hear all that feedback. And sometimes we would even go, I remember I was with Sheila randomly, and we were at like some dinner place, and some guy was like really upset about not getting his application through. So it's just like one of those moments in time where you're just like drinking Skinny Girl at night. You're like, I'm never gonna get over this. Like, this is sad. Everyone's upset. So to me, a renaissance. We're still in this time, but how do we learn from that, right? Because some of the really valuable feedback was from the customers or hiring managers. And even though the act requires us to give, you know, the highest standing candidates or rank the candidates, how do we define that? Does that mean we have to have such a rigid system to get to the same endpoint? So those were some of the things that I think that I'm proud of, that we actually listened and kind of were able to adapt and change. But I think it's super important to remember where we've come from, especially when people are asking you, like new cabinet secretaries or leadership, and say, let me just hold a second. Let me kind of show you or explain to you how this has evolved. So, okay, so that's kind of, to me, the bigger picture. What are we gaining? What were we gaining out of exempting a bunch of people for not attaching their transcripts? Some people might push back and say, well, I know what you're getting. If someone can't understand how to follow directions, why would I want them anyways? They're going to be a crappy employee, or whatever the case may be. But that's really not for us to decide, right? The hiring manager is responsible for reviewing an application and making those determinations. So I think that was a key moment for us when we thought about, what does the act really say, and how can we be more flexible and still be in compliance? So that was a huge learning moment, and empowering those hiring managers, because lots of times we're behind the scenes doing everything for them, saying, here you go, and they're not part of the process. So as a hiring manager, you know your job, you're part of the process of advertising your job, and you're also part of the process of deciding if people should be given an interview. So those are all things to think about. We're there to provide guidance, but if they're not empowered in that process, then we've already kind of lost. We were so involved that they weren't involved in the process, and I think that's when all the more confusion kind of was created, and they felt like, why is SPO telling me I can't hire somebody, right? When this person, you know, might be perfect. The other thing, I like to talk about is, because I've been in recruitment so long, I get lots of questions. So every time that Justin would go, or even director before, Mosier, would go to a hearing, and the hearing would have nothing to do with recruitment, I always would have to go every single time. Because guess why? They're gonna start asking, yeah. Guess what they're gonna ask? Yes, you knew that though. Cheating. No, but yeah, always time to fill. And so we were actually audited. I don't know if you remember that, the whole NeoGov process. We had to go in front of the committee. And so what we did to prepare was, well, let's go back and look at all our other LFC audits, or let's look at everything out there. And through all those phases of history that I talked about, guess what they were critiquing us on every single time? Time to fill, every single time. And so we know we've gotten better, right? So it was really important for us to point out, here's all the things that have happened through history and how we've evolved, but they still had that common kind of critique. And how much of that process can I own, right? And how much of that process do we collectively own? So I like to point that out, because that information is available to anyone. They want to look at it, those reports and those things. And sometimes I think it's super important, especially if you're just in a moment of time and you're hearing somebody critique something, it's good to know the bigger picture, especially when you have to respond. But I do think some of the current process improvements that we made when Share went live, it's actually a little over a year ago, last July, for everybody, we made some of these process improvements for the agencies that were consolidated before July of last year, have actually decreased the time to fill quite a bit. So you as HR being able to give your list right away, only certifying people they actually care about rather than spending hours looking at people and they're going to tell you in 2 seconds, give me more, or no thank you, or where's Drew, you know, things like that. So we have decreased the days to fill. And I thought it was really funny because when Pam was showing us, I think our last, our report card, we got like a green, right? And so I was like, I thought I was gonna have like a party or something, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been like beating myself up for like years. And they were like, okay, next, here's the thing you suck at. I'm like, oh dang, I didn't even get like a little, woo, no. So I just like aged myself for no reason. But I thought that was really funny. It's like a funny thing in life. You're like worry about something and then they're like, yeah, next. So, and then I have the link when we send the information, you can access this information. So the quarterly reports I think are really helpful because you can just look from a macro point of view, what's happening. Days to fill, we break it down for your agency. And then it might start giving you ideas about, well, what else can I look at? Or can SPO help me pull this kind of data so that you can make more informed decisions when you're dealing with managers or supervisors. Okay. Okay. Oh, we don't want to skip min quals. Okay. So min quals, our favorite things. Where can we find them? Sometimes we get questions. They're on the class descriptors. How were they established? So sometimes we deal with managers and they're really angry and they'll be like, why did you give us these min quals? Or this is wrong. So it's really a partnership, how they get created between the agency, SMEs, and SPO and the SPO board. There is an opportunity if something was missed or something's not right, you guys need to tell us. And lots of times we'll see or we can tell by some of the questions that are asked. And then we just need to work with class and comp and say, okay, we need to make these right. The financial coordinator series is a perfect example. Do any of you have financial coordinators? Stephanie does, Donna. So basically, what were they saying that was completely limiting and a little like, anyone know? They said in state government. So you had to have that finance background, government experience. So that's kind of like, wait a minute, why did we do that? The rules say I have to have 2 pools of candidates, right? Internal and external. Why are we limiting this experience to a certain sector? So we were able to work with class and comp and make that change so it's not so limited. And remember, I said a little while ago, if you think about when they were all grown or created and the circumstances everyone was under, like we should really be making sure we look at all of them and make sure they're correct, right? And so we've changed a lot along the way. Financial coordinator is just the most recent that I was really happy about. And they worked really closely with DFA at the time those classifications were created. But sometimes if you don't have the knowledge of recruiting with minimum qualifications and the limitations that you can create by segmenting a pool of just a certain type of experience, you don't want to limit the manager from having other perspectives or an opportunity. So sometimes if the change is minimal, they can be changed with the director. So sometimes when they're more expansive, or if you're creating a new classification, they go through the board first. Shouldn't be in isolation. They support the class descriptor. So we get lots of questions about, they're isolating the min qual and saying, no, they meet it, or yes, they do. But you really have to understand what home the min quals are in. What does the class descriptor say? All these things are connected. So you can't just look at them in a bubble. Substitution language, we have a lot of questions because if you look at the class descriptors, do you know that generic sentence? It says, what does it say, Cliff? Education will be substituted for experience on a year-for-year basis. So for most of us, we're like, okay, we're HR people, but for your average applicant, I have no clue that if the job is bachelor's and 2, that I could have a master's and 0, or high school and 6. Yeah, so you'll see on all of the advertisements a table and it'll say this is how you qualify for the job. So that was something we were really happy about so that applicants and hiring managers can clearly see the scenario. So we have a question about semester hours. So it's a really good question. And, you know, someone might say, well, I don't have a bachelor's degree, but I have, you know, 18 credit hours, and what will that give me? So when they established minimum qualifications, they don't account for semester hours. There's specific classifications like tax and rev, which you have to have, you know, 3 hours of accounting or 12 hours. But I think that's a good point, and it's something to think about long term, because to think if there is some type of substitution for semester hours, but that's a good question. Okay, so this is our HRA. You know, it has a bachelor's degree, human resource, business admin, and then it lists the different disciplines. These minimum quals to me it reminds me of like some type of like English thesis course, because you have to pay attention to all the little words. Does it say and? Does it say and or? Does it say, so it's really important to pay attention to those key little connector words. This one says and or. So can I qualify for this job with just benefits administration experience? Yeah. If I'm posting for a recruitment job, they can still go, but if I'm a hiring manager, that's on me, right, to make that determination. And if a hiring manager is asking you to interview somebody for a recruitment job that just has blank, that's when I'd be like, help me understand that, because I just created a whole posting for you based on something else. So, but I always think pointing out those key words are really helpful, because when we get questions, that's exactly what we do. We break it down and say, okay, what's the criteria here? I like to include this next one because it's everybody's favorite. Who loves doing this one? Yeah, I know, right? So management analyst, we call it kind of like a catch-all, but the language, so experience in the procedures of business and management principles involved in strategic planning. That's what I mean, like, So that's kind of what I mean by isolation and a bubble, right? These things don't just exist alone. They're in the classification descriptor, and then most importantly, you picked them as a classification because they meet that criteria for your job. So in order to be able to be really successful at looking at candidates, you got to understand what the job does and your specific job that fits in that classification, because it's not created equal. So a job like this would have different criteria depending on the job you're filling. Right. So that was some of the problem that we had when we used to put that minimum qualification on advertisements, because it was misleading. And so we worked with Class and Comp and literally created a table on the advertisement so you could see which scenario do I fit, if any. In those scenarios, though, they do not include semester hours, just so you know. They're just degrees. But it is important to think about, because I think like HR, you can make an argument for anything, right? I can make an argument that a secretary is responsible for processes of business and management principles, right? I can say a high-level data person can also meet that criteria. So it's an interesting part of our job, but I just like to point it out because it's everyone's favorite. I also like recommended qualifications. They're listed on all class descriptors minus the managers, but at least it gives you an idea if you're hiring somebody in the middle of the pay band, what kind of qualifications they should have or bring to the table. It's not black and white, it's not set in stone, but at least if you're working with a manager who has no clue on what to pay or where they should start, you should say, here's what an ideal candidate looks like flat in the middle of the pay band. And sometimes that's a good baseline to start talking about salary. So we did that a lot for all the agencies that we were responsible for when we were consolidated. We used these types of tools to help us engage with managers and start the conversation. Could it make sense that you would hire somebody above midpoint with less than midpoint quals? Sure, we do it all the time. Depends on what they bring to the table, the diversity of their experience. Just because I only have 1 year in this, that 1 year might be super valuable depending on the job and really hard to find. So it's all about how we justify. And in order to justify a hire, you just have to know your job and know what you're looking for. Otherwise, you'll see the holes. So the managers that are carved out now that have specific criteria have the recommended quals. Cool. That makes sense. Okay. Where can I learn more about jobs? Once you get this, this PowerPoint with the different sections, you'll have the links so you can go there. I was talking to, I think, Gilbert at DOT the other day, and we were talking about a job, and he was asking me, well, what does this degree related or not? And we talked about where we can learn more about just the nature of the work itself. Department of Labor is really helpful resources. The ONET, these are not inclusive, so these are not like the only places in our Bible, but at least it's a reference point to learn more about an occupation. And sometimes it helps managers too when they're trying to determine classification. So when I first started at SPO, I don't know if you remember, Leanne, you probably remember, they printed out the books for us. They were like your little, well, they were kind of like your Bible, but you know, it would be a good reference point. But now it's all online. I'm not going to go over each key term, but I thought it was really cool to have a section for you guys to have that just talks about things that we have gone over that are in direct relation to recruitment. The definition between an applicant and a candidate is very different. And someone like Sandy Martinez, who deals with labor exclusively, this is a big deal for her, right? And how we define and what each one means. So an applicant is a person who applied for a position. A candidate is different because they are on the employment list for a position. So anyone can be an applicant, right? I can apply for an attorney job and be an applicant, but I don't, I'm not on the candidate. I'm not a candidate yet because I'm not on the employment list because I didn't qualify for the job. Because we have an automated recruitment system and I screen you out if you say you don't qualify. So everybody who said they qualify, do you know what I mean? So that's another way of looking at it too. We're taking a step further to make sure the people they want to interview meet the quals, because we don't want to get to the end and have to disappoint somebody, candidate, and then of course the hiring manager when they have it in their head that they're going to be able to hire somebody. These two key terms, established requirements, minimum quals, I'll point it out because they're in the rule a couple times. And I think we're going to have to work on, it's just a terminology thing. We're so used to saying min quals, that's our baseline, and it's an easy word to understand. But if you look at the key term and the way it's defined in the rule, established requirement is really like your min qual, right? The min qual is defined as statutory requirements required by law, which shall be used to reject candidates. So it's just important to think about what we've been using and the definitions in the rule. We talked about these three. They're in that first section of the rule under vacant positions. Temporary promotion, intra-agency transfers, also in this section of the rule. Also, there's a section there about asking for a reduction, a section for temporary emergency appointment. I didn't put those things in this presentation because I just wanted to focus on the recruitment items that we're talking about. So I don't want you to think these are only the key terms. So I didn't include everything. Okay, so we're going to go over this. We're not going to go over one by one, but our goal is when we do these trainings, Pam talked about these 6 trainings, we want to provide you with kind of like a guidebook or tool so that, let's just say you didn't have the benefit of coming to this training, or you came to this training and it's not going to all be retained, right? How do I have things to reference that I can use to make my job better or make my job easier? So we say Applicant 101 with Sheila because Sheila is, you know, one-man band, and she's helping most of you when you call, and then we're helping the applicants, more importantly, that call us, right, that have questions. And you guys, how many of you get questions from applicants? Yeah, not as many as I would think. You, okay, Gerard, I was going to say, Gerard used to work here, so he's a pro at this. Okay, so we've just listed some of the most frequent questions that we get. Our rules clearly say that we have to provide the employer of a ranked list. So then I would say the rules trumping your internal policy on this one. But anybody who made that top grouping, that's internal, and your policy says that, then a lot of you are interviewing internals, I think, just out of courtesy too. Now, even if your policy doesn't say it, if they qualify, at least that's what we see. So these are just her tips. And I think, you know, like resetting your password, and that's helpful so that you have that there in front of you. So if you're talking to a candidate, sometimes I might even get, like, if I'm at a barbecue, a family member might ask me, and then I'll be like, oh, here we go. Let me just send on this page. We have admin access here. So if someone is having a really hard time, we can help because I know their username. So sometimes it's really hard when you're dealing with applicants and they don't know. I don't know my username or my password. So if I know their username as an admin in the recruitment system, I can tell them their username and just reset their password. And sometimes applicants are having more trouble than others. So if you don't want to stress somebody out and they're not getting it, just give me an email and I can just do it over the phone, or walk to Cynthia's desk and ask her to help me because I forget every time. So Sheila's answer is, if someone's asking about where they are on a list, if we can help them and we're, right in front of a computer, we will help them and let them know where they are on a list. But because we're thin, a lot of times we'll make sure that we refer them back to the agency. You have to be really mindful of who your contact is though, because you wouldn't want them calling a hiring manager and asking them that, because the hiring manager is going to be like, I don't know, or you're not on my list. So we've given the recommendation that you can have up to 2 contacts. You can have an HR contact for questions like that, and a hiring manager. Okay, so here's the last part I added, which I think is super fun, which I would like to have your feedback on. And how many of you were listening to the podcast yesterday? So we did a workshop about kind of some of this material. So I've been getting lots of questions about best practices, or even questions from managers directly being like, what the heck do I do and when do I do it? Just around the interview process. So I feel like we've spent so much time figuring out how we're going to get the system to work in a process that's not so overbearing on human resources, that now we can focus on actual recruitment and working with managers to get some good results. So we're calling it Infinity and Beyond, or thinking outside of the box. And what I read a lot when I read about hiring, one of the, like if you read surveys, one of the biggest complaints from employers is this whole process, is they can't find people, right? And when they really look into it, guess what their real problem is? Keeping people, retention. So how many of that is your problem? Especially if we're seeing that we're hiring a lot of internal people, whether that be within our agency or crossing agencies. So that kind of information is powerful. So the more you know, then we can start tweaking it and making recommendations or coming up with ideas on how to kind of move forward. Pam kind of did a good job going over the data, but the data basically tells us, at least in state government, we have tons of candidates. You have a big external presence, but it seems like we're more comfortable, or whatever the reason might be, that we're hiring internal. So if a hiring manager is, and sometimes we've seen this, especially when we were consolidated, because all we did was deal with hiring managers, they're very reluctant sometimes to go outside of what they know, right? Or someone's expertise within the job that they're trying to fill. And it's not because they don't want to hire somebody, it's because they're slammed or they're bogged down, right? And they're like, oh, I just need somebody like now. And if somebody knows my world or has that government type of experience, that to me is going to be a better investment. So our job is to really get them to start thinking about, is it really a better investment, right? Or are there other options if your ideal candidate or what you're looking for isn't right in front of you, or as black and white as you might think so, right? The power of investing in somebody, all those good things. What kind of skills are you looking for that can predict somebody that will be really beneficial? And it's not about them having those technical skills that you're looking for. So I read a lot yesterday, I thought was really funny, about the funnel. And a lot of times we'll say, like, I'll look at a job and I'll see 100 people or 90 people on it. And are we creating a system just to funnel everybody in who's interested? And is that even worth our time, right? Or are we creating a system where we're getting, it might not be as many applicants, but at least the applicants we're getting are worth our time, right? Or what the manager is looking for. So that's another way to look at it. So when we redid our process and reformatted our ads, when we went with Share, we started thinking about those things. That's why we're asking you to pinpoint the purpose of the position and to think about what the job does, how it gets done, who it's done for, to think about who your ideal candidate is. Because if you don't do those things, or the manager is not thinking about it that way, you're going to get the funnel and you're going to get everybody and their mom in there. And that's going to look good, like, oh, you got 100 people. But is it really good if you're not like focusing on what you need? So sometimes a bunch isn't really better. So I like that term that they were using. And then I want to talk about steps to a successful interview. So we get tons of questions about this. And I was just talking to Energy and Minerals not too long ago about it. Anything you read, like the first thing on like 20 top 10 lists is prepare. Managers have to prepare for this process. And prepare means having a timeline and sticking to it. And that's one of our biggest kind of issues, right? Because when we look at days to fill, it's with the manager for a big chunk of time. So, and that's not because they're not doing their job. A lot of times they're just doing 50 other things and they're having to make decisions, right? I was just talking to April about this. She has a job she needs to fill, but she's having to make decisions. So do I do this interview or do I not do payroll, right? So obviously she's going to do payroll, but those are things to kind of think about. And when you talk with a manager, they have to be ready to dive in and prepare, and they have to think about the questions they're going to ask. They have to think about what kind of interview they want to do. And some managers might be like, what kind of interview? I don't even know what that means. But that's where we can help. So that's why I wanted to get your feedback, because I would like to take these last 3 slides and make them into a class, hopefully an online class for hiring managers. But I just wanted to get your, we asked a little bit yesterday in the workshop, and we got lots of feedback that people are doing different things and they're willing to share, but do you think that would help you guys so that a hiring manager can get some of these really key informations and then links to resources if they want to dig deeper? Sandy?
Well, Stephanie and I were talking, we both said that the panel is probably pretty critical. That you really get a good diverse panel to help you make that decision when you're doing the interview.
Yeah.
That they have some knowledge, and some of them maybe may not have the exact knowledge for the job, but they bring other criteria as a panelist that can help you make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of data out there about panel members, panel groups. It's pretty clear that they want one panel member to be kind of, not the leader, I should say, but the person making sure that it's choreographed or going the same way. Panel numbers are a big thing that people talk about, that they're not too large because they can be intimidating to candidates and it could be difficult to come to a consensus at the end. Definitely the hiring manager needs to be involved. So yeah, those are all things that are sometimes not so black and white. It depends on the kind of job you're filling. Those are all factors that are going to come into play when you're thinking about your panel. Yep.
I have to teach my hiring managers sometimes that you're not going to always find the perfect candidate that walks in with all the experience, with all the job knowledge. Training is going to be required, you know, for some things. And I think sometimes they're passing up on people that would definitely with training can do the positions, but they're looking for somebody that can do everything and hit the ground running because they don't have time to train. And so we have to explain to them training is a big part of their job as managers.
Yeah, and sometimes it just takes a couple managers to trust you, and then they're your biggest advocates and supporters to other managers, so that when you go to staff meetings or those types of things, you know, they're willing to look at something a different way. Questions, interview type, those are all important. You guys, if you've taken any, you know, read or looked at any current things, you'll see types of interviews. How many of you heard of behavioral interview, competency, situational? When you read about what's important now, it's kind of like a combination, right? Because competency is going to get you more of an attitude, and it's going to get you more of what someone's attitude will be and the specific skill set that they have. Behavioral will get you more about how they handle situations from real life experiences. And then situation is just like the word, right? Tell me about a time when you did this. Situational is getting lots of props right now, but I think depending on your job, sometimes you need all 3. You need to think about all different ways. I read a funny thing yesterday, and it said, you know, the question, tell me about your weakness. And it said, go ahead and lie to me. So like questions like that, managers might not, that might be like, oh, I'm gonna ask that. Or I got asked to be on a panel, and they were, and it asked, one of the questions was, tell me about yourself, or tell me about your hobbies. So that seems pretty innocent enough and a good icebreaker, but what do you think some of the potential pitfalls of a question like that could be? Yeah, right? That's easy for you guys. But for a manager, that then they don't ask you, or we're not reviewing their interview questions, it could cause you a nightmare later in life. But I get lots of questions on follow-up questions. Like some agencies are, some hiring managers feel like they're going to do something wrong if they ask a follow-up question, and they're scared because they're like, I don't want to stray from the path, because they're taking what HR might say very literal. And, you know, obviously you don't want to ask somebody a different set of questions, but if I need, you know, Janine to clarify something or help me understand, that's okay, right? And so we want to be able to hire the best candidate, and we're not going to do that if we're uptight about it, or we don't understand what a follow-up means, as opposed to asking a totally different question. But you'd be surprised how many times we get that. And then we talked a little bit at the podcast yesterday. You guys wanted a list of questions you should not ask, but we can share that. But does anyone have any fun ones to share? Oh, do you have kids? Oh, gosh. Yeah. Yeah. But I think it, you know, they're easy to us, but it can't hurt to have those collectively. And then to me, it's more important as we move forward as a group that at least we all have the same type of material. It doesn't mean that we all have to use the exact same, or something might not apply to everybody, but at least we're starting from a level playing ground, and we're approaching managers and supervisors from the same perspective. My last one is what good interviewers do after an interview. There's a lot of information about that now. It's really like one of your biggest opportunities to sell your agency or market your agency. Think about how many people actually get a job. I think it's like 2% out of all the people who actually apply. And what was that experience for all those other people that didn't get selected? And what are they going to say about your organization and your hiring managers? Yep.
One of the things we hear a lot when we do our job fairs and stuff is, you know, I applied for a state job 3 months ago and I never heard anything. What we've tried to start within CYFD is that we send an email when we move them onto the hiring manager, so that they're kind of getting some updates throughout the system. We don't have any templates for that in Share, but we make our own. And we send them out, and we get fewer and fewer phone calls. And, and we've noticed that people aren't coming back as nasty, going, well, I'm never going to apply for the state because they never tell you anything. You know, and so we're trying to work on that aspect just to keep them updated and on track. We do get a lot of feedback about time. You know, nobody ever tells us anything. We don't know anything.
Yeah. So that's a good idea. Maybe we can put some generic templates in there, Sheila, and we can recommend that people use them. And it's just another tool. But yeah, that's a big deal. And even, you know, that's a big part of it. And then those that are even chosen to be interviewed are a big part of it too. We should go an extra step with them, right? Or the manager should call, or a letter template that you provide them. I liked the word silver medalist, because every time someone gets the job, almost every time you have a silver medalist, right? So someone who's in second place. So what are we doing with hiring managers for them to start thinking about their silver medalists? Maybe they might not be good for this job, but we're going to recommend them for this job. Or that's another way to help fill your jobs, is to keep those people in mind, and the power of that, especially when you're having a hard time to fill some tricky jobs or hard to fill jobs.
That's what we've been telling hiring managers and telling.
Questions, interview type, those are all important. You guys, if you've taken any, you know, read or looked at any current things, you'll see types of interviews. How many of you heard of behavioral interview, competency, situational? When you read about what's important now, it's kind of like a combination, right? Because competency is going to get you more of an attitude, and it's going to get you more of what someone's attitude will be and the specific skill set that they have. Behavioral will get you more about how they handle situations from real life experiences. And then situation is just like the word, right? Tell me about a time when you did this. Situational is getting lots of props right now, but I think depending on your job, sometimes you need all three. You need to think about all different ways. I read a funny thing yesterday, and it said, you know, the question, tell me about your weakness. And it said, go ahead and lie to me. So like questions like that, managers might not, that might be like, oh, I'm gonna ask that. Or I got asked to be on a panel and they were, and it asked, one of the questions was, tell me about yourself or tell me about your hobbies. So that seems pretty innocent enough and a good icebreaker. But what do you think some of the potential pitfalls of a question like that could be? Yeah, right. That's easy for you guys. But for a manager that then they don't ask you, or we're not reviewing their interview questions, it could cause you a nightmare later in life. But I get lots of questions on follow-up questions. Like some agencies are, some hiring managers feel like they're going to do something wrong if they ask a follow-up question, and they're scared because they're like, I don't want to stray from the path, because they're taking what HR might say very literal. And, you know, obviously you don't want to ask somebody a different set of questions, but if I need, you know, Janine to clarify something or help me understand, that's okay, right? And so we want to be able to hire the best candidate, and we're not going to do that if we're uptight about it or we don't understand what a follow-up means, as opposed to asking a totally different question. But you'd be surprised how many times we get that. And then we talked a little bit at the podcast yesterday. You guys wanted a list of questions you should not ask. I think it, you know, they're easy to us, but it can't hurt to have those collectively. And then to me, it's more important as we move forward as a group that at least we all have the same type of material. It doesn't mean that we all have to use the exact same, or something might not apply to everybody, but at least we're starting from a level playing ground and we're approaching managers and supervisors from the same perspective. My last one is what good interviewers do after an interview. There's a lot of information about that now. It's really like one of your biggest opportunities to sell your agency or market your agency. Think about how many people actually get a job. I think it's like 2% out of all the people who actually apply. And what was that experience for all those other people that didn't get selected? And what are they going to say about your organization and your hiring managers? Yep.
One of the things we hear a lot when we do our job fairs and stuff is, you know, I applied for a state job 3 months ago and I never heard anything. What we've tried to start within CYFD is that we send an email when we move them on to the hiring manager, so that they're kind of getting some updates throughout the system. We don't have any templates for that in Share, but we make our own and we send them out, and we get fewer and fewer phone calls. And, and we've noticed that people aren't coming back as nasty, going, well, I'm never going to apply for the state because they never tell you anything. You know, and so we're trying to work on that aspect just to keep them updated and on track. We do get a lot of feedback about time. You know, nobody ever tells us anything. We don't know anything.
Yeah. So that's a good idea. Maybe we can put some generic templates in there, Sheila, and we can recommend that people use them. And it's just another tool. But yeah, that's a big deal. And even, you know, that's a big part of it. And then those that are even chosen to be interviewed are a big part of it too. We should go an extra step with them, right? Or the manager should call, or a letter template that you provide them. I liked the word silver medalist, because every time someone gets the job, almost every time you have a silver medalist, right? So someone who's in second place. So what are we doing with hiring managers for them to start thinking about their silver medalists? Maybe they might not be good for this job, but we're going to recommend them for this job. Or that's another way to help fill your jobs, is to keep those people in mind, and the power of that, especially when you're having a hard time to fill some tricky jobs or hard to fill jobs.
So can we offer a hand to Andrea, who like put this together?